Negentropy. Now, where the heck did I pull that one from? First of all, a story. There was something different about Joe. A welder in his early 60s working in a South Chicago plant, he worked alongside 200 people in a cavernous and gritty hangar-like warehouse displaced by sparks and staccatoed clangs as the railroad cars were assembled. It was a place described in the summer as an oven, and in the winter as having icy winds on the prairie howling through. As a welder, Joe was positioned at the lowest rung of the plant's hierarchy, and yet he'd worked there for over 30 years. He wasn't incapable though. In fact, the opposite. He was not only a masterful welder, but he could do any job on the floor, practically with his eyes closed. Every job in the building, Joe had learned everything with no formal training. As he said himself, he was just fascinated with machinery in general. He especially loved machinery that had broken down. This was a call to action to figure out how it worked, patiently try to mend the problem, and persevere on the intoxicating anticipation of making it work again. As a result, he was considered an indispensable part of the team. Everyone knew Joe and unanimously agreed that he was the most important person in the entire factory. His manager remarked jokingly that if he had 5 people like Joe, his plant would be the best in the business. Not everyone shared Joe's enthusiasm though. In fact, well, there was no one. When interviewed, his comrades revealed that they regarded their jobs as burdens to be forgotten when the bell rang through at the end of the day. In clusters, they'd head into local saloons strategically built on every third corner of the gridded streets surrounding the industrial centre. This made his lowly status all the more confusing. He was offered countless promotions throughout his tenure, but politely declined every time. He said he wouldn't be comfortable being a foreman, being somebody's boss. He was happy being a welder on the bottom rung of the factory floor. Simply enough, that's just the way he liked it. The modesty was remarkable. But actually, this wasn't what was really different about Joe. No. What was different about Joe was that no matter what he was doing in this seemingly inhumane environment, a weed-infested urban neighbourhood, Joe would nevertheless find enjoyment in his task at hand. He has what is called an autotelic personality, what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi describes as the ability to create flow experiences even in the most barren environment. Csikszentmihalyi is the author of the best-selling book Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, and it's this term, flow, that is the subject of today's episode. It broadly describes the ability to find immense, almost effortless satisfaction in your activities. For the uninitiated, however, it can come across as a little more ambiguous. So we're going to define its scientific equivalent today, which is what we call negentropy, a term that ironically sounds even more ambiguous, but have faith. For every mysterious term, there will be a low-hanging fruit sitting before it that will carry our understanding forward. It's my hope that by the end of this episode, you'll have a crystal clear mind map of the neural pathways that lead us to that inviolable term we call flow. Let's do this. With the story out of the way, we're on to part 2, science, to see what objective truths the story might highlight. But first, with an all-essential caveat. Science isn't broken, but it's a hell of a lot harder than we give it credit for, to paraphrase the data analysis blog 538. What does this mean? Well, humans are not rational creatures. Scientists are no different. We see patterns, we unconsciously jump to conclusions, we screen data to confirm our hypotheses, and as a result struggle to replicate findings. Point is, just because I mentioned the word science doesn't mean you should take these studies as gospel. Lessons can be taken, but sleep with one eye open. Correlation is not causation. Read my favourite book in the world to understand more. In physics, the second law of thermodynamics introduced a radical new idea, something physicists called entropy. As physicist Brian Cox explains in season 1 of his fantastic BBC series, Wonders of the Universe, entropy explains why, left to the mercy of the elements, mortar crumbles, glass shatters, and buildings collapse. With that in mind, let's flip entropy 180 degrees to its antonym, the opposite term, negentropy, what we might refer to as reverse breakdown in a physics context. Mortar rebuilds spontaneously, glass repairs itself, and buildings re-emerge naturally. Spontaneously? Of course, we run into a problem. Entropy always increases, it never decreases. It's why time only runs in one direction, Cox explains. Consider that a sandcastle made of millions of sand grains can be destroyed naturally as time marches on through our understanding of gravity. Wind and rain can speed up the process, but it's not going to rebuild itself. When those grains of sand are dispersed into a flattish mound, they will not be reassembled again into the ordered state of what we would call a castle. In physics, we don't typically observe the phenomenon of negentropy, and so it's not a term with the relative popularity of entropy, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a useful role to play in how you see the world. So what are we to do? Well, that's where we reintroduce psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. We're going to explore the concept of negentropy through the lens of psychology rather than physics, where the nature of things is not as constrained. Think of negentropy as when you're in a state of thought, a moment whereby you feel completely in control of your body, your thoughts, and the world around you. So much so that time seems to melt away. And when aroused from your mysterious state of frictionless activity, hours have passed when you believed only minutes had gone by. Csikszentmihalyi calls this being in control of our psychic energy. It's a term that nowadays carries connotations of self-help and positive thinking, but note that Csikszentmihalyi is a highly regarded scientist, and that this term was introduced in 1990 when the book was published, before the self-help wish the weeds away industry cannibalized terminology like this. It's a term that's very difficult to translate into the language of science, and so serves as a useful bridge to expand our knowledge. In the book, Csikszentmihalyi shares stories and findings to define the recipe for optimal experiences. Initially, these studies were conducted with a small internal team, but eventually became international in scale. Csikszentmihalyi's team began working with universities around the world. Subjects taking part in the study were asked to wear, in his own words, an electronic paging device for a week, and to write down how they feel and what they are thinking about whenever the pager signals. With what amounts to a running record of daily moments for subjects in the study, the book reveals insights into how we might produce more flow experiences in our own life. One of those subjects was a highly regarded rock climber who made a clean distinction between this process of psychological negentropy and the rest of his life. The rock climber says, "It's exhilarating to come closer and closer to self-discipline. You make your body go and everything hurts. Then you look back in awe at the self, at what you've done. It just blows your mind. It leads to ecstasy, to self-fulfillment. If you win these battles enough, that battle against yourself, at least for a moment, it becomes easier to win the battles in the world." It's important to recognise, Csikszentmihalyi explains, that the battle here isn't really against the self, but against the entropy that brings disorder to consciousness. It is really a battle for the self, he says. It is a struggle for establishing control over attention. While negentropy doesn't have to be physical to the extent of rock climbing, it necessarily needs a similar degree of disciplined concentration and obliviousness to the wider world. It doesn't matter whether you're sweating beads or moving chess pieces. One of the most frequently mentioned dimensions of the negentropic experience is that, while it lasts, one is able to forget all the unpleasant aspects of life, Mihaly explains. This is a crucial feature of the negentropic experience, where attention is narrowed to the extent that we lose awareness of all the evidence we are not in control of our lives, and often our bodies. Negentropy in a physical sense may be about reverse breakdown, but in a psychological sense it's about the careful reduction of awareness. It's the removal of stress awareness. More broadly, this raises interesting questions about what happiness is. Is happiness an abundance of fortune, or a scarcity of stress awareness? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Take fortune. Many people think money would make them happy, but money doesn't reduce stress necessarily. It replaces poor person stress with rich person stress. Rather than worrying about the bills, we might worry about who our true friends are or where to invest our money. However, reducing stress awareness, whether with a fortune or not, is comprehensively narrowing awareness of stress versus just some symptoms in favour of others. Consider, for example, getting drunk, which reduces awareness of everything. Consider that while not all drunks are happy, there are certainly fewer worries to think about. Is it an error of judgment to attribute our happiness to money, all the while we have no empirical evidence of having large sums of the stuff? Csikszentmihalyi continues, "One reason why flow improves the quality of experience is that the clearly structured demands of the activity impose order and exclude the interference of disorder in consciousness. In effect, by narrowing awareness, we perceive an orderly world, and so can focus on more happy things, things that we are in control of. Typically, this is through an activity that demands our attention." Csikszentmihalyi interviewed a professor of physics who was an avid rock climber who described his state of mind while climbing as the following: "It's as if my memory input has been cut off. All I can remember is the last 30 seconds, and all I can think ahead is the next 5 minutes. Not only does temporal awareness evidently decrease with time flying by, but spatial awareness reduces too, as that's intricately related to the limits of our memories. This is measured through the concept known as the availability heuristic. As our subjective universe shrinks down, our perceived control expands in what frankly is delusional, although typically not dangerous. In a sense, we become the masters of our own little universe. This sensitive balance is the psychic chemistry of world-leading athletes, meditation practitioners, and those people who really piss you off because they love their job. Consider Edwin Moses, the successful hurdler. Your mind has to be absolutely clear. The fact that you have to cope with your opponent, jet lag, different foods, sleeping in hotels, and personal problems has to be erased from consciousness, as if they didn't exist. This can only be achieved through a highly disciplined and conditioned state of concentration. Or consider this interview with a dancer. I get a feeling that I don't get anywhere else. I have more confidence in myself than at any other time, maybe an effort to forget my problems. Dance is like therapy. If I'm troubled about something, I leave it out of the door as I go in the dance studio. The normal state of the mind is chaos. Think for a moment about the fact that people would rather receive an electric shock than be left alone with their thoughts. Numerous studies have been conducted over the years measuring sensory deprivation, and what's observed is that without externally structured activities, the organisation of consciousness breaks down. Without external scaffolds to wire our thoughts onto, we feel lost, and so we feel afraid. George Miller, one of the founders of 20th century cognitive psychology, said, "The mind survives by ingesting information." Negentropy represents a heightened degree of concentration and perceived control on how our thoughts interface with the external world. Rather than the world changing, it's our awareness that narrows to block out the chaos of uncertainty. The enhanced control we feel over our internal and external world are, for a moment at least, subjectively one and the same. We are both omnipotent and omniscient, all-powerful and all-knowing. We are practitioners of carefully controlled delusion, and it's just about the best natural drug you can get without the side effects. As a final word on negentropy in the science section of this episode, it's perhaps appropriate to take it back to its origins in physics, with the Nobel Prize-winning Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger, who introduced the term negative entropy, shortened to negentropy, in his 1944 science book, What is Life? In this context, it carries a more fundamental definition to mean things becoming more in order, as we've learnt throughout this episode. He claimed that organisms survive by ingesting negentropy. If true, this means the opposite must also be true, that the brain cannot survive in a vacuum, a conclusion that vindicates the findings in sensory deprivation experiments. It means perhaps that rather than negentropy or flow being an optional high in life, like meditation or massages, it's actually an essential aspect of well-being, an essential exercise in narrowing a hopelessly complex world into manageable micro-universes that we might feel in control of. Encouraging negentropy into our lives might just be a practice as essential to well-being as sleep is to rejuvenating our energy in preparation for fighting another day. To finish out the episode today, I'd like to leave you with a practical takeaway, something that you can perhaps implement into your life today as a direct result of the subject matter of this video. Again, I'm going to lean on the great Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi to offer some guidance and then offer my own interpretation of his research. Csikszentmihalyi reveals in his book that the two areas of our lives most important to us for our sense of worth and happiness are our human relationships and our work. But these alone are not enough, he says. One is still vulnerable to the vagaries of chaos. Relationships come and pass out of our control. The economy swirls around our vocation, disrupting our routines and forcing us to question our purpose, a trend that is increasingly apparent as the gig economy takes its hold. What's needed is a bird's eye view on our lives, a philosophy that turns all life into a unified flow experience. Csikszentmihalyi explains that if a person sets out to achieve a difficult enough goal from which all other goals follow, and if he or she invests all energy in developing skills to reach that goal, then actions and feelings will be in harmony, and the separate parts of life will fit together. And each activity will make sense in the present, as well as in view of the past and of the future. In such a way, it is possible to give meaning to one's entire life. While it's true that life has no ultimate meaning humanistically, he concedes, it does not necessarily follow that life cannot be given meaning. It is one thing to recognise that life is by itself meaningless. It is another thing entirely to accept this with resignation. The first fact does not entail the second any more than the fact that we lack wings prevents us from flying. Throughout human history, countless attempts have been made to assign goals in life that gives meaning to experience and to overcome the fear of death. Almost always, the last step on a path of experimental rationalization winds us up at assigning a purpose that extends beyond the grave. It's the only way goals can avert the fear of death. In the ancient Greek civilization, men sought to achieve immortality through heroic deeds, according to social philosopher Hannah Arendt. Alternatively, in the Christian world, men and women hope to reach eternal life through saintly deeds. Immortality and eternal life are two of the endpoints of rationalizing purpose and death. Ultimate goals must accommodate the issue of mortality, says Arendt. They must offer men and women a purpose that transcends life itself. Both immortality and eternity accomplish this, but in very different ways. In this thinking, no ultimate goal can be achieved during life, because upon achieving it, we lose our reason for being. Life is for the goals in pursuit of the ultimate goal. The corollary would be retirement, the common case of the man or woman who has lived for their work and finds that retirement zaps them of their energy for life. For me personally, it is a principle, not a binary goal that can be unfinished and finished. I live to create value for other people. It's very simple. It's something I can rationalize in almost any scenario throughout life. I can publish YouTube videos without concern about what haters think. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm trying to create value. YouTube videos are just one avenue on the ultimate goal to produce value for others. To tackle mortality, it needs to pass the deathbed test. Can I still rationalize creating value on my hypothetical deathbed? Yes, I can offer one last smile, one last piece of advice, a gesture, all reassuring ways in which I can have an ultimate purpose throughout my entire life. In almost any scenario throughout life, I am aware that I have a purpose, and core to its effectiveness is that it has few conditions. It's unlikely that I'll reach a point where I question my purpose. All goals radiate through this intention. No matter how much the world throws at me, no matter how jaded I become at the world, the economic insecurity, the corruption in the institutions we collectively must depend on, I at least have this. And it's with that security that I can sleep at night. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not consider purchasing one of the books that inspired today's show? It helps the authors who write, me who produces, and you who implements. Thanks for watching, share your thoughts below, strike a like, and if you're feeling really daring, hover over the subscribe button and see what happens. Thanks.